What if a heart could become a desert, scoured clean by grief, until nothing but rock and sun-scorched sand remained? What if the only thing that could make it bloom again was not a gentle rain, but the desperate arrival of a storm? In the unforgiving expanse of the Sonora, where the heat was a physical weight and the sky an endless, indifferent blue, a woman named Elena was learning the answer. She was the storm, and she was looking for a place to break. The world had shrunk to the burning ache in her lungs and the fragile warmth of the baby she clutched to her chest. Samuel, her son. He was a quiet, listless bundle, his soft cries weakened by the sun that had pursued them for 3 merciless days. Every step was a negotiation with oblivion, her cracked lips whispering a prayer to a God who had long since seemed to abandon this blistered landscape. Her past was a pack of wolves at her heels, a life of shadowed luxury and cold-hearted bargains that had ended with the death of her husband and the cruel decree of his father. She was a thief, he had claimed. The child was property, a bloodline to be controlled. So she had run, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the tiny, beating heart that was the only real treasure she had ever possessed. The desert did not care for her reasons. It demanded its toll in sweat and tears, promising only a grave of unmarked sand. Then she saw it. Through the shimmering haze of her own exhaustion, a structure rose from the flat earth, not a mirage, but the skeletal remains of a barn, its wood bleached to the color of bone. It was a derelict promise, a hollow hope, but it was enough. She stumbled toward it, her vision blurring, the world tilting into a vortex of heat and shadow. With the last of her strength, she pushed through a groaning door and collapsed into the dusty, straw-scented dark, pulling Samuel close as the unforgiving light was finally eclipsed. She had found a place to hide, a temporary reprieve from the sun, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her despite the heat, that she had only found a more comfortable place to die. She did not know that the land, as barren as it seemed, was not entirely empty. She did not know that her desperate flight had led her to the one place in all the desolate miles where a heart, as scarred and silent as the desert itself, might just recognize her as a storm worth weathering. He found her because he knew the language of his land. Isaiah was a man carved from the same hard rock as the canyons that surrounded his small, isolated homestead. He moved with the patient deliberation of a creature born to the harshness, his eyes missing nothing. The warped door of the old barn, ajar by a hand's breadth, was a sentence written in a dialect only he could read. It spoke of desperation, of an intruder too weak or too careless to cover their tracks. His hand rested on the worn handle of the pistol at his hip, a gesture as natural as breathing. He was a solitary man by choice, a choice forged in the fire of a loss so profound it had burned away all desire for the company of others. The world had taken everything from him once. He would not allow it to take anything more, not even his peace. He pushed the door open, his body a tense silhouette against the blinding afternoon light. The interior was a cathedral of dust motes and dying sunbeams. At first, he saw only a heap of faded calico, a discarded piece of some forgotten life. Then the shape resolved itself. A woman, her face streaked with dirt and the salt of dried tears, her hair a wild tangle of sun-bleached brown. She was unconscious, or perhaps worse. His jaw tightened. A squatter, a vagrant. Trouble that had wandered in from the hellish flats. He took a step closer, his duty as a landowner warring with the deep, instinctual desire to turn around, bar his own cabin door, and pretend he had seen nothing. Then he heard it. A sound so small it was almost stolen by the whispering wind that snaked through the broken slats of the barn. A tiny, mewling sigh. His gaze dropped from the woman's face to the bundle clutched in her arms. A baby. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and cracking the stone that encased his heart. He saw not a stranger's child, but a ghost. a memory of a different small face, a different fragile life that had slipped through his fingers like dust. The hardness in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a raw, aching pain he had not allowed himself to feel in years. The pistol at his hip felt impossibly heavy, a useless tool against this kind of invasion. He holstered it, the quiet click echoing in the sudden, profound silence of his resolve. He knelt, his movements surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. He didn't know her story. He didn't care. The desert was about to claim 2 more lives, and he, Isaiah, was the only one there to argue. Elena awoke to the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. The searing heat had been replaced by a gentle, enveloping warmth. She was lying on a narrow cot, a rough but clean wool blanket pulled up to her chin. For a moment she thought she had died, and this was some strange, rustic corner of heaven. Then a soft gurgle from nearby brought reality crashing back. Samuel. She sat up, a wave of dizziness washing over her, and her eyes fell upon him. He was nestled in a makeshift cradle, a hollowed-out wooden crate lined with a soft, worn-out shirt, placed near the hearth of a small stone fireplace. He was sleeping peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Relief, so potent it was painful, flooded through her. Her gaze swept the room. It was a one-room cabin, meticulously clean and sparse. A simple table and 2 chairs, a shelf with a few tins and a worn Bible, a rifle mounted above the door. It was the home of a man who owned little and wanted less. And then she saw him. He was sitting at the table, his back to her, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes of a whetstone. He was broad-shouldered and still, a figure of intimidating quiet. When he heard her move, he stopped, placing the knife down without a sound. He turned, and Elena found herself looking into the grayest eyes she had ever seen, eyes that seemed to hold the vast, lonely expanse of the desert itself. He rose and walked to the hearth, ladling a thin, savory broth from a pot into a wooden bowl. He brought it to her, his movements economical, his expression unreadable. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply offered the bowl. Her hands trembled as she took it. "My son," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "He's safe," the man said. His voice was like his presence, a low rumble, unused to conversation. Gave him some goat's milk. He took it. He gestured with his chin toward the cradle. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate, hollow. He gave a short, dismissive nod and returned to his chair. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from or why she was half dead in his barn. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of her child. It wasn't an unkind silence, she realized, but a protective one, a wall he had built around himself. She was a stranger, a burden, yet he had brought her into the heart of his solitude and given her son back his life. "I'm Elena," she offered to his back. He paused his work for a fraction of a second. "Isaiah," he said, and then the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel began again, a sound that was both a comfort and a clear, unspoken boundary. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Isaiah never asked her to leave, and Elena never asked to stay. It was an arrangement born of necessity and sustained by a mutual, cautious respect. She learned the contours of his solitude, the way he would disappear at dawn to check his traps or tend to the small herd of goats that were his livelihood, only to return at dusk, a silent pillar of dust-caked exhaustion. He spoke little, his words reserved for essentials. "Woods low. Storm's coming. The boy needs you." Yet his actions spoke volumes. He fashioned a better cradle for Samuel, his large, calloused hands surprisingly nimble. He shared his meager rations without comment, ensuring she and the baby ate first. He would sit by the fire at night, ostensibly cleaning his rifle, or mending a piece of tack. But Elena knew he was watching them, his gaze lingering on Samuel with an expression of such profound, lonely sadness that it made her own heart ache in sympathy. She, in turn, worked to earn her keep, to transform herself from a burden into a part of the cabin's silent life. She scrubbed the floors, mended his worn shirts with thread. She painstakingly unraveled from the hem of her own dress, and learned to cook the tough desert roots and sparse game he brought home. The cabin, once just his shelter, began to feel like a home. The air filled with the smell of her baking and the soft sounds of Samuel's coos and gurgles. It was a fragile domesticity, built on a foundation of unspoken traumas. She could see the ghosts in his eyes, the shadows of a wife and child she was certain had once filled this space. He, in turn, must have seen the fear that still clung to her, the way she would startle at the sound of a horse in the distance, her hand flying instinctively to her son. One afternoon, while Isaiah was gone, she found a small weathered wooden bird hidden away in a chest. It was crudely carved, but made with love, its edges worn smooth by small hands. She held it, a relic of his lost world, and understood that his gruffness was not a wall to keep the world out, but a shield to protect a wound that had never healed. She placed it back carefully, her secret knowledge a new tender thread in the tapestry of their shared silence. She was beginning to feel safe, a dangerous and unfamiliar sensation. But the world outside Isaiah's protective orbit had not forgotten her. The silence was about to be broken. The illusion of their sanctuary was shattered on a Tuesday. Isaiah had ridden to the dusty outpost that passed for a town, a half-day's journey for supplies. He hated the town, hated the prying eyes, and the whispers that followed him like burrs on a blanket. They called him the ghost of the canyon, a man who had buried his family and then himself. He endured it for the flour and salt he couldn't produce himself. While he was bartering, he saw it. A notice, freshly nailed to the community board outside the general store. It was a handsome reward offered by a Mr. Bartholomew Thorne for any information leading to the recovery of his widowed daughter-in-law and his infant grandson. It described Elena perfectly, painting her as a flighty, grieving woman who had stolen away with the Thorne heir in a fit of hysterics. The words were a calculated lie, designed to elicit sympathy for the powerful man and suspicion for the desperate woman. Isaiah felt a cold fury rise within him. He saw the way the men in town looked at the notice, their eyes glinting with greed. He tore it down, crumpling the paper in his fist, ignoring the storekeeper's protest. The ride home was tense, the setting sun painting the clouds in angry strokes of orange and red. He found Elena sitting on the cabin steps, singing a soft lullaby to Samuel, who was asleep in her arms. The scene was one of such profound peace it felt like a knife to the gut. This was what Thorne wanted to destroy. This was what he had to protect. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Finally, after Samuel was asleep in his cradle, Isaiah sat across from her at the small table, the light from the single lantern casting long shadows on his grim face. He placed the crumpled notice on the table between them. "Bartholomew Thorne," he said, his voice flat. Elena's face went white. All the color drained from her, leaving behind a mask of pure terror. She stared at the paper as if it were a coiled snake. "He found me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He knows I'm here." "He knows you're in this territory," Isaiah corrected, his tone hard but steady. "And he's offering a reward. But he doesn't know where here is." She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with tears, pleading with him. "They will turn me in. For money, they'll—" She couldn't finish the sentence. He watched her, his own past rising to meet her present fear. He knew what it was to have everything torn away by a cruel world. He had retreated. She had run. Now their paths had converged. He reached across the table, his large, rough hand covering her small, trembling one. It was the first time he had touched her with such deliberate tenderness. "No one is turning you in," he said, his voice a low, unshakable vow. "This is your home now. He'll have to come through me." The promise hung in the air between them, a shield forged in the firelight. For the first time since she'd fled, Elena allowed a sliver of hope to pierce her fear. Isaiah's quiet certainty was more reassuring than 1,000 shouted oaths. He was a man of the rock and the earth, immovable and solid. In the following weeks, their quiet alliance deepened into a partnership. He began to teach her the ways of his world, not as a guest, but as an equal. He showed her how to read the sky for weather, how to find water, which plants were medicine and which were poison. He took her to a secluded box canyon and taught her how to handle the rifle, his hands briefly and gently guiding hers as she learned to aim. "A woman in this land needs to know how to protect what's hers," he'd said, his eyes meeting hers with a meaning that went far beyond marksmanship. She, in turn, brought a softness to his hardened existence. She planted a small, tenacious garden of herbs by the cabin door, coaxing life from the stubborn soil. The cabin, once silent, was now filled with the sound of her humming and Samuel's happy babbling. She was slowly, carefully, piecing together the story of his past, not from his words, but from the things he didn't say, from the way his gaze would fall on the empty space beside him at the table. She learned his wife, Anna, and their daughter, little Lily, had been taken by a fever that swept through the territory 5 years prior. He had been unable to save them, and in his grief had blamed himself, retreating from a world that had become a monument to his failure. She understood now that in protecting her and Samuel, he was fighting the ghosts of his own past, finally standing his ground against the helplessness that had haunted him for so long. Their bond was no longer just about survival. It was about healing. It was in the shared glances over the sleeping baby, the way he'd leave a rare desert wildflower on the table for her in the morning, the way she'd save him the best portion of the stew. It was a love story told not in poetic words, but in quiet, steady acts of care. But like a distant rumble of thunder that precedes a flash flood, the outside world was gathering its forces. A greedy ranch hand from the town, remembering Isaiah's defiant act of tearing down the notice, put 2 and 2 together. The reward was a temptation he couldn't resist. For a handful of silver dollars, he rode east, carrying the location of the Ghost of the Canyon's homestead to the men who were willing to pay for it. The peace was an illusion. The storm was finally coming. The dust came first, a faint plume on the eastern horizon, almost indistinguishable from the haze of the afternoon heat. But Isaiah saw it. His eyes, honed by years of watching the subtle shifts of the desert, knew it was not the wind, it was riders. And they were riding hard. "Elena," he said, his voice low and urgent, cutting through the quiet afternoon. "Take the boy. Go to the canyon." He didn't need to say more. She saw the grim set of his jaw, the way his hand had already found the handle of his pistol. The terror she had kept at bay for weeks returned in a cold, sickening rush. But this time it was different. It was laced with a fierce, protective anger. They were not just coming for her and Samuel anymore. They were coming for this life, this fragile peace, this man who had become their entire world. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She strapped a sleeping Samuel into a carrier on her chest. "I'm not leaving you." He turned to argue, to force her to safety, but he stopped when he saw her face. The frightened, desperate woman who had collapsed in his barn was gone. In her place stood a woman of terrifying resolve, her eyes blazing. She walked to the wall and took down the rifle he had taught her to use. "You said a woman needs to know how to protect what's hers," she said, her hands steady as she checked the load. "This is my home. You are my family." The word hung in the air, an admission so powerful it stole his breath. Family. A word he thought he'd never hear again. A flicker of something gratitude, love, fear for her crossed his face before the hard mask of the protector slammed back into place. He gave her a sharp nod. The dust cloud was closer now, resolving into the shapes of at least 5 riders. At their head was a man on a fine black horse, a man who rode with the arrogance of wealth and absolute authority. Bartholomew Thorn. Isaiah stepped out onto the porch, his own rifle held loosely at his side. He was a lone figure against the vast, empty land, a bulwark of quiet defiance. Elena took up a position at the window, the rifle resting on the sill, its barrel pointed toward the approaching threat. The riders reined in 20 yards from the cabin, their horses stamping and blowing in the dust. Bartholomew Thorn, a man with a face like a clenched fist, dismounted. "Isaiah," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm told you're harboring a thief. Send out the girl and the boy, and I'll forget you were ever involved." "She's not a thief," Isaiah called back, his voice calm and even, carrying easily in the still air. "And she's not going anywhere," Thorn sneered, a sour, ugly expression. "This has nothing to do with you, you hermit. That boy is my blood, my heir. He belongs with his family." "He is with his family," Isaiah stated, and the words were a declaration of war. Just then, Elena stepped out of the cabin to stand beside him. She held her head high, Samuel secure against her chest, her fear now a cold, hard stone in her gut. She would not hide while this man fought for them. "He is my son, Bartholomew," she said, her voice clear and ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You will not have him. He will not be raised by a man whose heart is as barren as this desert." Thorn's face contorted with rage. The calm, biddable daughter-in-law he remembered was gone, replaced by this defiant woman. "You ungrateful wretch! After everything my family gave you." He gestured to the 2 hired guns with him. "Take them." The men hesitated, their eyes on the rifle in Isaiah's steady hands and the one now resting in Elena's. This was supposed to be easy. Suddenly, one of the men, a jumpy youth eager to impress, drew his pistol. "Drop the guns!" he yelled, his voice cracking. Isaiah didn't even flinch. His eyes remained locked on Thorn. It was this stillness, this absolute lack of fear, that unnerved the young gunman. His finger twitched. A shot rang out, wild and panicked, kicking up dust a foot to Isaiah's left. In the fraction of a second that followed, Isaiah moved with a blurring speed that was terrifying to behold. He didn't fire his rifle. He dropped it, drew his pistol, and fired a single, precise shot that struck the gunman's pistol, sending it spinning from his grasp with a sharp crack of metal on metal. A second shot from Elena's rifle kicked up dirt at the hooves of Thorn's horse, a warning shot that was perfectly placed. The remaining gunman froze, his hand hovering over his own weapon. He looked at Isaiah, who stood like a statue carved from granite, his pistol now aimed squarely at Thorn's chest. He looked at the woman, whose aim had been just as sure. He looked at his employer, a man of money and bluster, and realized he was on the losing side of this fight. Thorn stared, his mouth agape. He had come expecting a broken woman and a reclusive farmer. He had found a fortress, defended by 2 people, with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a humiliating, impotent rage. He saw in Isaiah's cold, gray eyes not just a threat, but a judgment. He was beaten. Without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, his hired guns scrambling to follow, leaving only a cloud of dust and the ringing silence of their defeat. The dust settled, taking with it the last echo of the hoofbeats. The threat, which had loomed like a thunderhead for so long, had vanished into the immense, indifferent landscape. The desert was quiet again. For a long moment, neither Isaiah nor Elena moved. They stood on the porch, side by side, the rifle and pistol still in their hands, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving behind a profound, trembling exhaustion. Samuel, awakened by the gunshot, began to whimper against Elena's chest. The small, fragile sound broke the spell. Elena lowered the rifle, her arm suddenly feeling as heavy as lead. She looked at Isaiah, her eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. The full weight of what he had just done, what he had risked for them, crashed down on her. He had faced down armed men for a woman he barely knew, for a child that was not his. He had stood as a shield between her and the world. Isaiah, she breathed, his name a prayer of gratitude. He holstered his pistol, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned to face her fully, and the hard, protective mask he wore finally crumbled. In his eyes she saw it all, the echo of his own past loss, the fierce, terrifying hope for a future, and a depth of feeling that left him speechless. He reached out, not for her, but for the baby. His calloused, work-worn hand, the same hand that had just aimed a gun with deadly precision, gently cupped the back of Samuel's head. The tenderness in the gesture was overwhelming. Then his gaze lifted to meet hers. His other hand came up, and his fingers brushed a strand of hair from her tear-streaked cheek. The simple touch was more intimate than any kiss, an acknowledgment of the battle they had just fought and won together. "This is your home," he said again, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He looked from her to Samuel, then back to her, his thumb stroking her skin. "Our home." The possessive pronoun was a quiet, powerful declaration. It wasn't just a promise of shelter anymore. It was a promise of belonging, a promise of a shared life. Elena leaned into his touch, closing her eyes and letting out a shuddering breath she felt she had been holding for years. The fear was finally gone, washed away by relief and a burgeoning, beautiful love. Here, in the heart of nowhere, defended by a silent, grieving man, she had found everything she had been searching for. She had found family. In the months that followed the confrontation, the cabin was transformed. The quiet, fragile peace they had known before was replaced by something stronger, more resilient, rooted in the certainty of their commitment. The ghosts of the past, while not entirely gone, no longer haunted the rooms. Instead, they became gentle memories, honored and integrated into the fabric of a new life. Isaiah taught Elena everything he knew, and in doing so, he began to heal himself. Showing her how to mend a fence or track a deer brought a purpose to his skills that went beyond mere survival. It was about building, providing, and nurturing. The lines of grief etched around his eyes began to soften, replaced by a quiet contentment. He started talking more, sharing small stories of his childhood, of the land as it used to be. He was slowly, carefully, rebuilding the bridge to the world he had abandoned. Elena, in turn, bloomed in the safety of his care. Her resilience, once a desperate tool for survival, became a source of creative strength. Her small herb garden expanded, a patch of determined green against the dusty brown. The cabin filled with the aroma of baking bread and the sight of wildflowers she'd gathered, placed in a tin can on the windowsill. She filled the silence not just with her humming, but with laughter, a sound that Isaiah came to crave like water in the dry season. Samuel thrived. He took his first steps on the cabin's worn wooden floor, his small hands clutching Isaiah's finger for balance. He learned to say Sila before he could say any other name, a fact that brought a rare, unguarded smile to the man's face. He was the heart of their new family, a constant, joyful reminder of what they were building together. Their love, which had been born in crisis and nurtured in silence, was now an undeniable presence. It was in the long, comfortable silences they shared watching the sunset, in the way his hand would find hers as they sat by the fire, in the lingering kiss he would press to her forehead before he left in the morning. They were a man and a woman who had both been broken by life, who had retreated into their own deserts of grief and fear. But in finding each other, they had found an oasis. They had discovered that the most barren ground can be made to bloom, if only it is tended with enough courage and with enough love. The desert was no longer their enemy or their prison. It was their sanctuary, a vast, beautiful testament to the life they had reclaimed from the dust. 5 years passed. The desert sun rose and set, marking the steady, peaceful rhythm of their lives. The small one-room cabin was no longer so small. A new room had been added, built by Isaiah's own hands, with timber he had hauled for miles, its windows looking out over Elena's now flourishing garden. The homestead, once a lonely outpost of grief, was now a vibrant pocket of life in the vast expanse. A boy of 5, with his mother's bright, intelligent eyes and his father's quiet, observant nature, chased lizards near the porch. Samuel, he was sturdy and sure-footed, a child of the sun and the rock, as much a part of the landscape as the towering saguaros. He carried a small, crudely carved wooden bird in his pocket, its edges worn smooth by his own hands, and the hands of the father who had made it for a different child so long ago. It was no longer a relic of loss, but a symbol of continuity, of a love that transcended blood. Elena watched him from the doorway, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. She was pregnant with their second child, a new life forged not from desperation and fear, but from a deep and abiding love. The haunted, frightened look was gone from her eyes forever, replaced by the serene confidence of a woman who knows she is exactly where she is meant to be. Isaiah rode in from the west, returning from checking the perimeter of their land. He no longer looked for dust clouds on the horizon with a sense of dread, but with the peaceful diligence of a man protecting his domain. He swung down from his horse, and his face, once a mask of hard-set grief, broke into a warm, easy smile as Samuel ran to greet him. He swept the boy up into his arms, a gesture of effortless affection, and pressed a kiss to his dark hair. His eyes met Elena's over their son's head, a silent conversation passing between them that spoke of shared joys, of quiet contentment, of a partnership that had become the bedrock of their world. They had faced the worst of the world and the worst of themselves, and had built something beautiful in the aftermath. They were a testament to the idea that a family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you build, the one you fight for, the one you find waiting for you in the most unexpected of places. He walked to the porch and wrapped his free arm around Elena, pulling her and their unborn child close. Together, the 3 of them stood and watched the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and deep gold, a promise of another peaceful day to come. Here, in the heart of the desert, 2 broken souls and a lost child had become more than survivors. They had become a legacy,